gives me no pleasure to say what I'm about to say because I worked with Pete Hegseth for 7 or 8 years at Fox News. This is an act of a war crime, ordering survivors who the law requires be rescued instead to be murdered. There's absolutely no legal basis for it. Everybody along the line who did it, from the Secretary of Defense to the Admiral to the people who actually pulled the trigger, should be prosecuted for a war crime for killing these two people.
That was Newsmax's senior legal analyst Andrew Napolitano pulling no punches and saying that Pete Hegseth and everybody else involved in the September 2nd strike should be prosecuted for committing war crimes. Now, the background here is that on September 2nd, the U.S. military struck a boat off the coast of Trinidad, and after the first missile hit, 2 survivors were spotted clinging to the wreckage. According to the Washington Post, Hegseth had given a verbal order to, quote, kill everybody, and so a Special Operations Commander, Mitch Bradley, ordered a second strike to fulfill that directive. Those 2 people were then blown apart in the water. 11 people total were killed.
All right, what's good, everyone? It's Nigel here, Trinidad Empowerment Network. So you saw that video, and things are changing, way more rapidly than I anticipated. Because I make no exaggeration when I say this. Something massive has happened over the last 72 hours or so. Because for months, 10 has been warning that the maritime strikes in the Caribbean Sea would eventually face international legal scrutiny. And 99% of the audience have been agreeing with that stance. So kudos to you. Today, we are seeing exactly that. Not from Caribbean activists, not from fringe voices, but from the mainstream American press. You saw that video. From the mainstream American press. Please like and subscribe to Trinidad Empowerment Network. Let's dissect all of this. Like and subscribe, please. Now, the language being used in the US media has changed dramatically in the last 72 hours. Major outlets are now openly referring to these operations as possible war crimes. We've called it murder here on 10 for the last few months, but they're calling it war crimes, especially the second strike that killed incapacitated survivors in the water in the Caribbean Sea. This is no longer a fringe accusation, 10. It is entering US legal and political vocabulary. This is a dramatic change in the narrative, in the direction of which this has been going. You know, here on 10, we've been talking about this for the last few months. It appears the mainstream media were playing catch up. It took them a while, but they are eventually catching up. Now, when large American newsrooms start using language like unlawful killing, illegal strike, and war crimes, it tells you something important. The official narrative is collapsing, 10. The official narrative is collapsing. For months, the messaging was simple, especially coming from certain sectors of the American press. They said that these were legitimate anti-drug missions, full stop. No moral questions, no legal doubts, no humanitarian considerations. And whilst a lot of outlets did call this a war crime, we call it murder here on 10. For it to be a war crime, there first has to be a war. We call it murder. But in any case, the moment classified footage was privately shown to lawmakers and the story made it into the press, everything changed. Suddenly, 10, the conversation is no longer about drugs or piracy. It is about whether the United States may have violated international humanitarian law by killing, surrendering survivors at sea. We have called this murder for the last few months because it was clear to us here on 10 that it was indeed murder. Now, let's be absolutely clear. Once mainstream media applies war crimes language to any incident, the political ground shifts beneath everyone who supported, hear me here, 10, from everyone who supported or defended the operation. Because the legal framing has changed. The legal framing has changed. I'm making no accusations here, 10. We bring you the facts. We bring you the facts. And here is where the Caribbean must pay attention. Trinidad and Tobago publicly, as you well know, Trinidad and Tobago publicly aligned itself with these maritime operations. The tone from the government for months was defensive and uncompromising. Fishermen's concern were dismissed. Your concern, the 10 views, your concerns were dismissed. Sovereignty questions were treated as exaggeration. Some officials even implied that critics simply didn't understand maritime policing. Some officials tried to shut us down. Because we had the audacity to speak the truth. That position is now becoming politically expensive, because when the global narrative becomes, or when the global narrative, should I say, shifts from anti-drug strike to possible unlawful execution, the reputational risk for small nations increases dramatically. The moral framing has shifted here, and this is significant. And that brings us to the acting Foreign Affairs Minister, Barry Padarath, who just issued one of the most surprising policy shifts, one of the most surprising policy reversals we have seen since the maritime operations began. Let me explain. Barry stated publicly that if a humanitarian crisis unfolds in Venezuela due to the U.S. military action, Trinidad and Tobago will stand with the Venezuelan people. Wow, what a shift, What a shift. What a shift in narrative, That is a stunning change in language. I'm sure you would agree. Because for months, humanitarian concerns was absent from the official messaging. The government aligned firmly with the maritime strike, the U.S. maritime strike narrative coming out of Washington, not with the Venezuelan civilians. The change in narrative is stunning to me. Stunning. So, the question is an obvious one for me. Why the sudden shift in moral tone? Why is empathy, say this again, why is empathy being expressed now? Why wasn't empathy expressed 3 months ago when the operations were causing diplomatic strain with Venezuela and anxiety among Caribbean maritime communities? Why now? Why the dramatic change now? See, hear me now. Political language does not randomly change. Messaging shifts when the cost of maintaining a previous stance becomes way too high. The cost of maintaining a previous stance is becoming way too high. Just as we predicted. I didn't think it would happen so quickly, so dramatically, but it's happening. Pay attention to what's happening. Because once the American press begins calling these strikes potential unlawful killings, the space for unconditional support disappears. It becomes politically dangerous to continue defending something that may eventually be judged illegal under international humanitarian law. The exact thing we've been saying here on 10 for the last few months is coming to be. It's like an epiphany. We saw it. We spoke about it here on 10. We saw it. We spoke about it here on 10 months ago. And it's coming to fruition. So what we see, or what we are seeing now, is not just humanitarian concern, it's political repositioning coming from the government. Messaging is being adjusted to avoid reputational fallout, especially if this second strike is formally deemed unlawful. A lot of people have questions to answer, possibly in the ICC. For the last 3 months, Trinidad and Tobago bet its regional diplomacy on the assumption that conflict with Venezuela was inevitable and that siding with Washington early would deliver long-term strategic benefits. It appears, as we predicted here, that gamble has not paid off. I don't want to speak too soon. But the narrative is shifting. If diplomatic pressure prevents war, which is the best possible outcome, which is what we're about here on 10, no war, Trinidad is now left with the most difficult problem. And that problem is rebuilding trust with Venezuela, a neighbor that controls maritime gas reserve, LNG boundaries, and long-term energy cooperation essential for our national economy. The gamble has not paid off. The truth is simple. We have aligned early with a conflict that may never happen. And we've strained relations with the very country whose cooperation, we need the most. Let's be clear here. Nobody is accusing our government of committing crimes. I want to be clear. No one's accusing anyone of committing crime. That is not the point, by the way. The point is that endorsements matter. Public policy positions matter. If an operation is eventually judged unlawful, history records who defended it, who dismissed it, and who remained silent when it happened. And I'm going to conclude by saying this. We haven't even touched on the real danger here. The real danger here is if future investigation conclude that the second strike violated humanitarian law, the political spotlight does not only stay in Washington, it lands wherever the support for the maritime strategy originated, including Caribbean governments. Caribbean governments that defended it without transparency. This should come as no surprise to you, 10. We've talked about this time and time again. When the narrative shifts from military operation to possible unlawful execution, the moral burden shifts as well. Leaders, 10, cannot retroactively claim they didn't know. You cannot plead ignorance in this case. The footage was referenced months ago. The warnings were public. We saw the resignation of the likes of Admiral Halsey. Regional concerns were raised. Legal scholars expressed doubts. We saw the pullback from the United Kingdom in sharing information with the United States. So 10, we must ask, what does Trinidad do next? What do we do next? Because right now, 10, we have a neighbor in Venezuela that controls much of our maritime future, our maritime economic future. We, by taking a gamble we have strained that relationship when we expected conflict between the United States and America. And that may still happen, who knows? But if no conflict occurs, and if media pressure forces Washington to scale back escalation, we will then have to rebuild regional trust. We will then have to reestablish diplomatic neutrality. And we'd have to protect our LNG corporation, which is surviving on a shoestring at the minute. And perhaps, 10, most importantly, Caribbean foreign policy must never again be shaped by assuming that great power conflict is inevitable. Because when that gamble fails, when that gamble fails, which it appears that it's going to do, small nations are left exposed. And this is exactly what's happening now. The only way forward now is full transparency. The United States must release the surveillance video and investigative findings. If the strikes were unlawful, public clarity protects everyone. If they were not lawful, accountability must follow wherever responsibility lies. Finish by saying this finally. And if you stay to the end, thank you. Like and subscribe. If accountability occurs, history will remember not just the people who ordered the strike, but the leaders, policymakers, and diplomats, of course, who endorsed it without question. So this is not anti-American. This is pro-Caribbean. This is pro-humanity, which is what we're all about here on 10. The zone of peace is what we are in the Caribbean. This is pro-humanity. This is pro-international law. Small nations must not live in the shadow of unexamined military action in our waters. So the chickens have come home to roost. It's a saying. Like and subscribe to Trinidad Empowerment Network. You know we bring you the best information. I try my best. But it's down to you and it's up to you. You created this channel. I bring you the best information I can. Jokes aside, I bring you the best information I can. Factual, relevant, and the exact thing we've been talking about is coming to fruition. In any case, I'd keep my ear to the ground and bring you the best information as I can. Like and subscribe to Trinidad Empowerment Network. Thank you to each and every single one of you. Look after yourself. Have a great weekend. God bless. Take care. Peace.